Today's class is called Introducing Joseph, and it conveniently lines up our 37th class with the 37th chapter of Genesis, which I do like symmetry when I see it. You see there Joseph's technicolor coat of fame and lore, and this marks the beginning of a long story, a novella, in fact, which is a fancy word for a short novel. And well, here we go. Rich Lowry writes in the Chalice Guide to the Old Testament, the Joseph story moves Jacob's family from famine in the Promised Land to prosperity in Egypt, continuing the theme of God's presence in exile. The narrative's smooth and rich character development leads scholars. Sorry, let me start that over again. The narrative's smooth flow and rich character development leads scholars to call it a novella, little novel. The journey from Canaan to Joseph, the visionary firstborn of Jacob's favorite wife Rachel, and the last child born to him in Mesopotamia. Born in exile, Joseph also dies in exile, his body preserved for eventual and the training was with Joseph through it all. I before about how we considered as a distinct with its own integrity, and that's largely true. While the narrative is smooth and can be considered as a distinct portion of Scripture, as with other parts of the Torah, though, different scribal traditions can be detected at times. And I think it's a lot of fun to find those little differences between scribal traditions, and we will touch on that as we move forward. And we can all see the redactor's work at reconciling the sources, the one who's putting it together, weaving it together. You can see that person's hand as well. And we will see that soon as we consider chapter 37 here in one moment. Now, was the Joseph Novella a story before the J source, the E source, and the P source got their own hands on it, or did they each contribute to it in their own way? And there are basically two opinions and no clear consensus on this. Fritsch writes one opinion, although there are indications that the text of the Joseph story as we have it passed through the hands of J, E, and P, the literary excellence, the unity of structure, and the movement of the plot seem to indicate that the story was originally conceived and written down by a single author. Again, that's one opinion. However, scholars debate as to whether the scribes from the J, E, and P traditions, that's the Yahwist, Elohist, and priestly traditions, added their own flourish to an earlier text, or if the Joseph Novella was originally contrived from multiple sources. That's the second opinion. While its cohesion and flow in its final form cannot be denied, the influence of J, E, and P is apparent, and scholars to this day debate what to make of this. It has more cohesion than earlier portions of scripture that we've already considered, where the different scribal traditions are more obvious, and yet you do see their influence as we progress through the story. And so, what to make of this? It's hard to know. There are also two breaks in the narrative where it appears material was inserted that does not appear to fit. The first we'll consider next week, actually, in the second lesson on the Joseph story, which really isn't about the Joseph story, which is chapter 38, which is a story about an entirely different set of characters, or not exactly entirely different. I mean, Judah is one of Joseph's brothers, but it doesn't seem to fit in the broader scheme of things. And then the second occurs in chapter 49, which we'll get to down the road. Fritham writes in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, when the Joseph story was written is not certain, but literary clues suggest that it may have been written sometime during the reign of Solomon, which places it between 970 and 931 BCE. A royal setting, he writes, is likely given leading themes, and the Solomonic era, with its positive relationship with Egypt, affords a probable background. So you may discern that the fact that Egypt comes off pretty well in these stories, it's not a negative portrayal of Egypt, that this was perhaps contrived during a time when Israel was at peace with Egypt, perhaps during the reign of Solomon. So on to the story. And there you see an historically accurate rendering of Joseph. Kidding. More of a storybook's rendering of Joseph. chapter 37, verse 1. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. The first two verses set the story in the context of Jacob's family. And that's a good reminder, because this really is a story about Jacob's family. We don't have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, then Joseph. It's really about those three patriarchs. And so the first verse in this story frames it as such. Fritham writes, at the least, this means that despite all the focus on Joseph, the reader must think fundamentally in corporate terms. This story narrates the emergence of Israel's family as Israel, the people of God, and Joseph being a catalyst for that event. In verse 2b, the first reason for Joseph's brothers' ire is stated. He ratted them out for some untold reason, or as it puts it in the text, he brought a bad report of them to their father. And no one likes a tattletale. But to be sure, the reasons for animosity between Joseph and his brothers were baked into the family system and a long time in the making. Of course, you probably know this by now. If you'll recall, Joseph is the firstborn son of Jacob's second wife, and as such, he should not have been treated as the primary favored son in that culture. And this is this newest tale in a long pattern of this kind of favoritism and the problems that it creates. The problem is made worse by a show of all-out favoritism. It reads in verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a long robe with sleeves. And I know, what about the coat of many colors? Well, the original Hebrew indicates that it was a long-sleeved robe that went down to the wearer's ankles and hands. And this was meant to signify an elevated status. A similar robe is referenced with the exact same Hebrew word in 2 Samuel 13, verse 18. No Technicolor dreamcoat for Joseph, I'm afraid, which I know as it sits in popular culture, that is a real bummer, and it doesn't jive with my Sunday school lessons from when I was young. But nonetheless, that is probably the way, actually, certainly the way that it should be translated, a long-sleeved robe. It got to be translated as multicolored coat when they made a Greek translation called the Septuagint. And in the Septuagint, from which they derived in part the the King James Bible of old, well, it relied heavily on the Septuagint, and so that's how we got that mistranslation. As fun as a multicolor code is, I'm afraid that isn't what we were meant to think here. But that is also not really that relevant, honestly. All this said, favoritism led to deep-seated hatred and contempt. That's the point. Verse 5, once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brother said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us? So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. He had another dream, and he told it to his brothers, saying, look, I have had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what kind of dream is this you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you? So his brothers were made jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So you see similarities, again, like his father Jacob. Joseph is a dreamer of dreams and also able to interpret dreams, although he doesn't do the interpreting in this in this chapter. He interprets dreams later, but we'll find out later he's an interpreter of dreams. It's his brothers and his father that interpret these dreams. Hybert writes, readers here find the Eloist's reason for the conflict between Joseph and his brothers. Joseph had dreams that predict his superiority in the family. So we're already seeing two literary strains here. In the Yahwist version, it's because he receives this coat as a token of favoritism. And here the favoritism is because, not the favoritism, the anger, the hatred is because of the dreams. And Eloist sources have lots of these dreams, these dreams and these visions from the divine. The first dream upset his brothers, naturally. Again, we have the motif of a younger sibling gaining an advantage over the elder or elders in this case. The second dream upset everybody, including his father Jacob, for it would seem to foretell not only of brothers bowing, but also of Joseph's father and mother bowing. Something, by the way, that never happens. We never have a scene where the father bows. But either way, his father rebukes him at first, but later ponders these things, keeping, quote, the matter in mind, unquote. And it is interesting that Rachel is mentioned in the present tense, indicating that she is alive. The fact that she remains alive in verse 10, we'll read back in chapter 35 to read of her death, may create some confusion, yet Genesis does not always present events in a precisely linear orientation. Should be no surprise to us by now, especially as we've learned about these multiple sources. She died back in Genesis chapter 35, according to one scribal tradition, and now here she is still alive. Of course, maybe we're not meant to think of this in a precise linear fashion, but still, I like these little details. Verse 12, now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel, notice the name change. It's been referring to him as Jacob up to this point, now Israel, which again, back in previous chapters, we've seen this going back and forth between Israel and Jacob being renamed Israel more than one time, as if it happened more than once. But okay, Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. He answered, here I am. So he said to him, go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, what are you seeking? I am seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. The man said, they have gone away, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. To give you some scale for the distance of this journey, Hebron is about 50 miles journey. And it's odd that Joseph stayed behind, really. We'd read about him being a shepherd just earlier. And maybe he did so because of the tension between he and his brothers. One may wonder why, in that context, Jacob/Israel would send Joseph to check in on his brothers when there's so much hostility and hatred between them. You already get the idea that they can't even stand to hear this guy talk or even his presence. So why send him out into the wilderness in pursuit of his brothers? Maybe we're to think that Jacob/Israel was naive. Did he hope that they'd find it in their hearts to reconcile? It's hard saying. Fritham writes, because the brothers moved to Dothan, which is 15 miles north of Shechem, even farther away from their father, Joseph has difficulty locating them, and only then through the hostility of a stranger. This delay heightens the drama, leaving Joseph vulnerably suspended between father and brothers, between love and hatred. And so here is actually a literary technique or strategy to help heighten the tension that I hope we can appreciate. The storytelling structure is akin to modern storytelling methods when the dangers a character is in is apparent to the audience, but less so to the character. So if you're aware of family dynamics and how Joseph would have been an outcast and how far it is to get to Hebron and then to Dothan, you would be feeling that same feeling perhaps that you'd feel when watching a movie, when that person enters into that basement or that dark space or that place where you know they shouldn't go, and you just know that the hammer is about to fall or they're about to meet some untimely end. This is a way of heightening the tension. So in these verses, you just feel it building and building and building. If you were in this culture hearing it for perhaps the first time, this is a way of suspense building. This picture, by the way, was captioned Joseph's well at Dothan. All I know was the caption. I don't know if it's an actual, if it's historically accurate. I don't know. But Joseph's well at Dothan may have looked something like that. Moving on. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So Reuben's trying to save his life, and he's going to secret him out of the pit. Verse 23, so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Reuben, as the eldest son, would have been laden with the most responsibility. He would have had to answer to his father for not only his actions, but the actions of his brothers as well. This is likely why he pleaded on Joseph's behalf with plans to rescue him. You may read compassion in his plea, or you may read self-perseverance, or perhaps a sense that he has this obligation and duty to his father that he takes seriously. Now, as we proceed, as I've been saying, the influence of Yahwist and Elohist sources will be evident, more so in the coming verses. Whether they were adding their influence to an earlier source, or whether they were supplying in part the source for this material, is debated and not settled in biblical scholarship, again, as I've already said. However, their influence seems obvious in the material that follows. In spite of the cohesion of this story and the way that it flows, unlike other parts of the Bible, you still will see here in the coming verses the different influences on the story. Whether they came before the story was penned or whether they were flourishes after is for debate. But either way, here they are. Verse 25. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. So in this passage, the acknowledgement of the Yahwist and Elohist influences on this story help bring some clarity to what's going on here. Was it Judah who advocated for Joseph's life, Reuben, or both? If you want to try to reconcile those two, seeming perhaps a discrepancy. But here's the real one I think is hard to reconcile. Was Joseph sold to the Ishmaelites or to the Midianites? Just in a few sentences, we have the Ishmaelites coming, and then some Midianite traders pass by, and they agree to sell them to them, and then they sell them to Ishmaelites anyway. What gives? Well, a few quotes from the Common English Bible Commentary should help. Hybert writes, Reuben, the Elohist hero, is Jacob's oldest son. Here, he appealed for Joseph's life with the hope of rescuing him from the cistern into which they threw him. But further down, Judah, the Yahwist hero, is Jacob's fourth son and the ancestor of King David. He makes mention of that, my aside here. He makes mention that he was the ancestor of King David because by the time the story was being read, they would know that the house of David would rise to prominence. And so Judah, who in the Elohist material may not have been treated as a very important character, is a very important character for those who value and think that all of this is looking forward to the Davidic monarchy, right? So why would Judah, the fourth son, also seemingly as irrelevant as Joseph, the 11th son, why is he being held up as some sort of hero? Well, this is probably why, because of when it was written and in the context of David's monarchy. So, but I digress. Here he appealed for Joseph's life and convinced his brothers to sell him to Ishmaelite traders. The identity of the traders who carried Joseph to Egypt varies between Ishmaelites in the Yahweh story and Midianites in the Elohist story. Fritham writes, the fact that both groups are descended from half-brothers of Isaac, hence Joseph's kin, see chapter 25, verse 2, suggest an interest in having descendants of Abraham through each of his three wives involved in the deed. Also keep in mind that these are stories that are meant to explain to later Jewish people how to live well amongst their neighbors. And so you had nation states like the Ishmaelites and the Midianites living alongside them. And you can try to imagine in this setting how it would be that in just 2 generations, you would all of a sudden have nations named after these two, what would it be, great uncles or great not too far removed relatives of Joseph. I mean, it's absurd to think that they would have so many children to have nation states. Well, because again, this is a national narrative to help explain relationships, and so it doesn't need to be taken necessarily strictly historically or as biography. That's another digression. On with the story. Verse 29. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So now we have, remember, we just sold to Ishmaelites. Now it's Midianites again. Again, more of the same, sort of going back and forth between sources. Tearing one's clothes was a sign of intense grief. Reuben tears his clothes in verse 29, as is his father in 34. Because Reuben conspires with his brothers to hide what has happened, we may infer that Reuben is no more sorry for his predicament than for Joseph's loss. Jacob is so wrought with grief, however, that he becomes convinced that he will take his grief to the grave. In other words, he will never get over this. The concluding verse of chapter 36 foreshadows what will follow. The concluding verse of chapter 37 foreshadows what will follow as the story is picked up in chapter 39. Joseph is sold to Potiphar, an important Egyptian official. In retrospect, this tragedy will turn out to be one crucial step towards Joseph's ascendance. To conclude, the conclusion of the Yahwist version is the brothers' deception of Jacob, echoing the terms of Jacob's deception of his father in chapter 27. Both involve a brother's fine clothes, the slaughtering of a goat, and an old father. In both, the father recognizes his son, but falsely. Note the tragic irony of the interference that Joseph is torn to pieces. The older brothers deceive their father, and Jacob, the younger son, grieves for his younger son. Jacob's false recognition is a measure of poetic justice for his deception of Isaac and anticipates the key moments of recognition to come in 38 and in chapter 42, writes Handel. So more of the same, more of these cycles of deception and people getting their comeuppance. In this case, it's Jacob, the trickster, who tricked his father, who is deceived and is lied to in this terrible way that his son has died. And then with many of the same elements, goat that is slaughtered, clothes being part of the deception. But to put a bow on it, put a pin on it for today, I guess, what we may ask as we return to the narrative are what we may ask as we return to the narrative are Joseph's thoughts through all this nightmare. Intended for a leadership role, he finds himself sold as a slave by his brothers to total strangers, traveling to a land about which he knows nothing. What about God's plan? How does this fit in? Writes Hamilton. By now, these themes should seem all too familiar. Joseph's narrative fits right in line with the narrative arcs of his forebears, who were called into the unknown. The main difference being Joseph has not responded favorably to the call, but has instead been forced into a situation he could not have desired. God has not been mentioned at all as of yet, but by the end, the reader will discover that God has been with him the entire time. Again, Yahweh was discovered to be with him and making a way for him through a seeming deadly circumstance and on into a future better than Joseph could have dreamed possible. In the centuries to come, various Jewish communities in exile could turn to this story for encouragement and hope that they too would make this same discovery. There are the sources that I used for this lesson. I'll bring us back. I see you've been riveted by our discussion into that stuff. Some of the things that I find very interesting, or perhaps not as interesting to others, you'll have to cue me in on what you'd rather me focus on. You may notice I get hung up on these little scribal differences because I just think it's so exciting to see the work of other humans putting together something that we are now appreciating today and understanding better how it comes to us.
Well, I'm going to take a different tack just for a moment and kind of ask a question about Reuben, because he was disfavored a few chapters back when he had relations with one of his father's slave wives. And so I thought he had been disinherited, but maybe not yet. So, and would he have tried to save Joseph or had a plan to save Joseph as a way of getting back into favor with his father? I mean, you're talking about him being the oldest son and therefore responsible for, taking care of his brothers. But was that his ploy to get back into good graces, or?
Perhaps. Let me get a book out that I have right over here, because your question has me curious. Where did I put that? Your question, I should stay more organized in here. Your question has me curious about which literary source has Reuben cut off in that way. Because his disinheritance really comes in chapter 49 when Jacob is speaking either blessing or curse over his children. And all of those who were caught up in the rape of Dinah affair are disinherited, but also Reuben for sleeping with his father's concubine. So that would have been chapter 30. I don't want to get caught in the weeds here. Let me come back to you on that, make a note of it.
Okay.
Because it depends on, so the commentaries I read said that those that held up Reuben as the hero of the story, who was trying to do the morally right thing, seemed to cast him in a favorable light. But then you have this other strain, which go back to our slides, which you can't see them, but just for my own sake of reference, I keep getting them switched up. Reuben is the Elohist hero, and then Judah is the Yahwist hero. And so I would be curious to see if the story where Reuben is disinherited is from the Yahwist source. I would suspect that it was, but I can't speak confidently.
Okay. And just in light of that, I mean, you gave that wonderful tree last time, the descendants of Jacob, and then who their descendants were. And so, if there are 12 tribes of Israel, does that mean like the descendants of Reuben were then disconnected from?
Well, eventually Israel would become very divided and fractured. And it would get divided into two kingdoms, divided between two tribes to the north and then the rest to the south. But even to what extent historically they cohered as a unified nation is still a debate among scholars. You have the biblical accounts of these events, and depending on what the agenda of the writer was, you either get a picture of a unified Israel that only falls to pieces because of unfaithfulness or idol worship or different things. And like, so when you, I said earlier, when you have someone like Judah lifted up as the hero, the scholars strongly suspect that that's because this is a very the scribes who are writing down that version of the story were very pro David's monarchy. And so you would see, I don't know if that answers the question. But here's the problem too, I guess, with doing all of this is, spending so much of our attention, which I do, on the literary sources or trying to just see the differences between them, can serve as an obstacle to just reading the story as a story. So within the world as the story, that's a very plausible hypothesis,
motivation.
And I think we should be able to, the whole tradition of the Midrash is to build on these stories by speculating and even adding interpretations that aren't really taking into consideration the literal historical intent. So, so yeah, that's maybe that'll preach. That'll preach in a sermon.
I was kind of taken with the fact that, Joseph surely understood that his brothers were not liking him. And yet he has this dream and he openly tells them about it, which, is saying, I'm better than you are type thing. And that just seemed kind of counter to what I would think someone like that who is hated. I mean, it's normal for them to kind of cower and stay away from what's bothering them,
It's hard to know if we're supposed to think of Joseph as just a naive young person who is just kind of aw shucks in his innocence, just sharing with his brothers, or taking the broader context, if we're not meant to see him, he's got this special coat that his father gave him. He's already been highlighted as the favorite, and then he has this dream that affirms that place. I've never noticed until this reading that Joseph, the dream that included his mother and his father, never happened. I never noticed that. I even double checked it and did several searches just to make sure that it wasn't an idea I came up with. I just assumed it would happen later. It would be like one of those details in a movie where you're like, wait, I thought they were setting us up for this. And that never happened. It must have cut that scene or something. I don't know. But it, and by the time that Jacob would have gone to Egypt, Rachel certainly would have been dead by then, because she would have had Benjamin.
Yeah.
So.
Well, there was that scene when they went out to meet Esau, and they thought they were all going to get slaughtered, or maybe it was after it was clear that they weren't going to get slaughtered. But I think Rachel holding Joseph's hand, they were in the front line. I mean, he presented them as like the favored, wife and child. Yeah. Even I think that they presented even before Leah. And
that's interesting. They were in the back, but that was the favored part. Like that was the back was the position of privilege and power. Yeah, safety.
Yeah.
I want to look into that.
So it just struck me as being like, there was a big whoop-de-doo over Rachel and Joseph. Like, here they are, the stars. And I think he's had a certain position of privilege and honor for his whole lifetime. But that was his favorite wife, and that was her firstborn, and she was thought to be barren this whole time, right? I mean,
those are the kind of questions. Those the kind of trying to discover if there are links between chapters like that don't quite fit the finished form. Those are the work that biblical scholars just love getting lost in. I'm not one of them, but you'll find papers on, I don't know if there's a pen and paper on that, but where it'll be like possible scribal link or tradition link between maybe two passages that don't necessarily go together as they're placed in the final form of the Torah or whatever writing we're considering. That is interesting though. If you could back read that, maybe the second dream was something that was in had its own document, and then there was another document that had this meeting between Esau and Jacob, and maybe they were meant to go together originally, and then later. That's interesting. I don't know.
Do we know how many years there are between Joseph and Benjamin?
Yes.
Is Benjamin already born when
forget.
he is?
Oh, yeah. No. Sorry.
I'll just Google it.
Okay.
Now,
And so we're going to believe Google.
That's right.
It'll hopefully lead me to a.
Yeah. Well, this scripture mentions that, Joseph was his favorite son because he was the child of his old age or something. And it doesn't even mention Benjamin.
Which makes it plausible that Rachel would be alive.
Mhm.
Yes. And it seems to me like the only time you hear anything about Benjamin is like when she dies, and
That's right.
that she dies in childbirth, and here's Benjamin. But
Yeah.
And I don't know how, that's a little farther down the way here, but
Mhm.
I'm not finding any clear easy answer to that question.
But I'm assuming when he's out there being sold by his brothers, Benjamin is not born yet.
I think in chapter 37 that is true, because Rachel is mentioned. She gave birth. She died in childbirth to Benjamin. So
Some distance from Ephrath, wherever that is.
yeah,
Dang.
I don't know. I like these sorts of funny questions.
Mhm. Well, it seems that it's almost like the image of royalty, that he knew he was the preferred son,
Mhm.
and he was unabashed about assuming that role.
The next time we see this word used to describe the same kind of robe, it's put on a princess in 2 Samuel. It's just
The other thing I wanted to bring up, I just because I woke up this morning thinking about it, knowing that we were talking about Joseph today, is a number of years ago, we set up this family church school. And so we had learning centers, and we had children and parents and some grandparents even there. And Connie's mother, Billy, was there. One of our learning centers was a Bible study, and Haley particularly thought that was very grown up, that we had Bible study at this particular spot, and Billy was sitting in on that. And it wasn't this first lesson, but maybe a little further into the story of Joseph. And Billy's comment was, well, Joseph always rose to the top.
yeah. He did in part by his.
And
Sounds like mom.
doesn't it sound like her?
Well, I shared a bit yesterday in the leadership council meeting for those 3 of you who were there, that he was different. He was similar to the other patriarchs in that he found himself exiled in a foreign land and needing to depend on God's providence. He's different in that he never responded to that call. It was foisted upon him. He was forced into it. And he had to claim his own volition and take his own sorts of actions in spite of the world around him. It wasn't like Abraham walking lockstep with God's call. It was just something that happened to him. And both are true to life, depending on who you are and what happens to you as you are alive. Some people really never, lots of things happen to them in spite of anything that they could have done. And then others are asked to leave places of complacency for the unknown. And at different times in my life, I've resonated with one or the other of those two things. So had any of you though ever heard, isn't not necessarily a bombshell, but for some it would be surprising that the coat wasn't a coat of many colors?
I'd heard that before though.
That
I
it
had
was,
not
it was.
heard it, but you know, when you look at all the different interpretations and you look at how many eyes were put on this and all the scholars that took place in this, I mean, it gets to the point where you know that some people are just making educated guesses based on history, knowledge of history, knowledge of lineage and things like that. And we all do that.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like the three wise men. Just by tradition. You've heard about
this is actually a story that you can actually trace. You can actually discern how we got to coat of many colors. So Hebrew doesn't have vowels. I think we may have talked about this in an early lesson, but it doesn't have vowels. And so when the Greeks were translating old Hebrew text into the Greek, at a time when Israel was occupied by Greece and Greek language was becoming the lingua franca, I guess. They began to translate the Bible into Greek. And those who only spoke Greek that didn't know, we were looking at those were looking at the ancient text had to sometimes guess at what the vowels were. And so sometimes they didn't get the translation right. Like we've talked about how Jehovah is a word that is not in the Bible, but it is based off of this guesswork at where the vowels go. We now know it's Yahweh. Well, when the King James Bible was being written, they had the Septuagint to go on, the Greek translation, which had already at this point mistranslated this Hebrew word into coat of many colors. And then with the discovery of what's called the Masoretic text, which scribes had put little dots and dashes above the consonants to tell you what vowels are supposed to be in there, then we learned a lot about words that we had been mistranslating or what we had gotten right, and this being one of those examples.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny. I read this, and in my mind, I read many colors, and it didn't say that.
But the King James Bible does, and consequently, the New King James Bible. Yeah, and I, it doesn't really make a difference. And the
only difference is he stood out. He got something different than everybody else did.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
long sleeves, lots of colors.
Yeah, something that
at the time it must have made a difference.
So I'm not going to storm into Sunday school classrooms and pull out the coloring pages from the children's hands and tell them
it's a lie. You've been tricked.
You are refused to live a lie. We will not have this kind of biblical inaccuracy. Not going to do that.
Well, one thing I we're talking about Joseph's attitude being kind of formed by how he was treated from a young age as being special, but the dream part, I wonder something about his innate quality, and I'll get to know him better as we read more of this story, because I've only read smatterings of this. I mean, the Old Testament has not been my thing, but I wonder if he does have a dreamy quality. And sometimes people are a little odd, like maybe he was indifferent to his effect on people, and he was a little bit of a.
That's what I was thinking, is that he was younger. He was having his dreams. He may not have known. He may have known on some level that he was special, but he didn't know the effect it was having on his brother.
Right.
So saying this to him was just relating what he dreamed.
Yeah.
I've met people who were very blunt and direct, and also were able to think of themselves in very flattering terms without any arrogance. Mm-hmm. It's hard for most people. It's hard for me. But I mean, if I'm sneaking in a brag, it's going straight to my head, even as I say it. But I've met people like that, and maybe he was somebody like that. And one thing that becomes clear later is he becomes wildly popular in Egypt. I mean, you get the sense that the Pharaoh himself is just taken with this person who has all of these positive attributes and giftings and can interpret dreams and becomes basically the savior of Egypt through very difficult times. I won't get it. Weeks from now, there is one story that is one of those another examples of the scribal tradition trying to figure out where to place it about Joseph that, in my estimation, is not flattering, and it doesn't seem to fit. And we'll get into that later. And when I read it this time around, I did not remember it before, and I know I must have read it, but I did not remember it. And we'll get to that in future weeks.
Did Google have an answer?
I could not find an answer. Not one that looked credible.
And therein lies the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for this time. Next week we'll be reading chapter 38, which is an obvious diversion from the story. It's clearly material inserted here. You could stop at 37 at the last verse and read on to verse 39, and the story picks up right there. Joseph in Potiphar's house, and this interlude with Tamar is I remember the first time I read it or was aware of it. I was in a Sunday school class as a teenager, and how are you going to read a story about a man, forgive me, ejaculating on the ground, which is what happens in it, and not lose your mind laughing, which is what I did. And then I got like, this is the Bible. What are you? No, this is serious. The teacher was trying to come to a really serious point, and I'm thinking maybe your serious point and the absurdity of what we're reading aren't mutually exclusive things. But that's a bit of a precursor for what we're in for here in a bit. It's actually a really fun story. Sort of. I mean, there's some, I don't like how Tamar is treated throughout, but she does. Well, you know what? We'll just read it and consider it next week.
I think the next 2 weeks I have appointments that are going to conflict. So I don't have my appointment book right here with me, but I'm pretty certain the next 2 weeks I have appointments. So I'll be sad about, but
we'll miss you.
I'll know. I'll miss all of you. I'll miss you.
I have a question off topic.
Sure.
Heath, did you contact John about not having delivery tomorrow?
I did. He
Thank
got
you.
back to me too. He received it. So we're all in the loop.
All righty, thanks.
And thank you for your kind words yesterday. That was very nice.
Oh, well, you've done a lot, and it's above and beyond.
Well, thank you for, I felt, well, I'm not gonna argue with you. I felt it was just what we needed to do, but thank you. Well, I'll sign off now then.
Okay.
Thank you for this time. Read chapter 38, and Judy, maybe watch the lesson later. And
oh yeah, sure will.
It's a lively story. I don't know if any of you have read it yet.
Okay.
Anyhow, take care.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.